Hello, everybody, and first and foremost, welcome to PEPR. Glad you could be here for so early on in the program. So we're excited to have you and excited to tell you about our topic, which is privacy paradigms for law enforcement response. So my name's Ben Ballard. I'm a senior cybersecurity engineer at the MITRE Corporation. I also do privacy engineering there and have a background primarily at this topic from academia, civil society, and doing more theory-based approaches to law enforcement response. If you want to do an introduction, Lucas.
I'm Lucas. I do the privacy equivalent. I've done law enforcement response for a bit, and I used to be in the military. So that's my background.
So we've been dancing around this topic for many years, but while we come at it from different perspectives, I want to give a disclaimer up top that this isn't an academic presentation. We're going to be pulling upon some civil society literature as well as just news articles, but we're not going to be talking about Lessig, we're not going to be talking about Landau or Rozenshtein, but even though you might see some of those frameworks invoked over the course of the talk. We're mainly trying to make it usable to all of you who we hope are our colleagues and practitioners. So, the agenda for today, we're going to be delving into a primary issue, which is that companies' transfer of data in compliance with law enforcement response is an old issue. But ultimately, there are evolving and new trends which complicate and exacerbate existing issues and pose significant risks. So, we are assuming that many of you are unfamiliar with this topic, but for those who are and deal with this on the day-to-day, we're going to try and give you novel perspectives that you can hopefully bring into your own work to address some evolving threats in the space. So we're going to start by talking about law enforcement responses in general, giving some background information, and then walking you through a map of current controls for how organizations deal with this process of responding to law enforcement requests. And then we're going to be talking about some remaining problems that exist despite the existence of those controls. And then finally, talking about recommendations and discussing potential paradigms that can be used to address these existing flaws. So what are law enforcement requests for information? Well, thankfully, it's relatively self-explanatory in that it can occur through many vectors and be done for many reasons, but ultimately it is a government entity, whether that's law enforcement or another government agency or their proxies, who are requesting information from an organization. Like I said, this can be done under many different auspices, but ultimately it involves, all of them involve the compulsory external external data production, colloquially referred to as a legal process, through which information is disclosed to a requesting entity. Like I said, this can come in many forms and have many different modifying characteristics, such as requesting entities, which you're likely familiar with. But the process is relatively uniform in that a law enforcement organization or a government agency prepares a request for a specific data type that could be used in the context of an investigation into a particular individual or organization for varying reasons. They prepare that request and send it to an organization. The organization intakes that request from the agency and prepares its own internal processes for gathering the information that's requested, invoking various processes that are used to kind of guide that. And oftentimes that very much varies depending on the maturity of the company that's dealing with the request. And then they package that and prepare a response, which is then sent to the requesting organization. So relatively straightforward, and thus it continues, hopefully not in perpetuity. We have varying, as I said, there's different types of requests that can be submitted, and a lot of times that's based upon the type of information that's being requested and the reason why. So the larger classification categories are oftentimes whether it's a regular law enforcement agency or it's one that deals with national security. And there are distinct characteristics related to both. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. But this is just kind of a representative example, categorization of different data types. It's not holistic, it's not authoritative, but just wanted to give you an idea of kind of the different spread of data types that are requested by different organizations. So this process is bounded by controls, which are implemented by different entities and at different stages. But we're going to be talking a lot about how organizations and companies put in place controls to guide this process. And those can be broken down. This is a similar kind of schema to Rozenshtein's surveillance intermediaries, if you're familiar with it, so it's going to be kind of mapping along those lines. But breaks down ultimately down to technological controls, procedural controls, and policy controls. So technological controls, they can come from two sides, which is that they can be done from the perspective of law enforcement and from the perspective of the organization that's intaking the request. So from a law enforcement perspective, you can imagine they're very concerned about detection and validating that a particular request is coming from an authoritative agency and it's not spurious, it's not malign, and it's not from an unvalidated source. Ultimately, they want to ensure also that that process is trusted and verified and not vulnerable to whether varying attacks, whether that's from a security perspective or privacy perspective. They may also be guided by certain principles, we hope, such as the law enforcement agency might not want to embed, in this case, live interception capabilities. You might be familiar with debates surrounding the Clipper chip back in the day, or embedding backdoors into existing systems to ensure law enforcement have, essentially can engage in live interception techniques. Hopefully that's going to be avoided in many of these requests. And then ultimately, if they're sophisticated, responsible pen testing. So that can be from an internal perspective, thinking about how nefarious actors inside a law enforcement organization might manipulate the process to get more data than they should, or from a sophisticated threat actor like an APT. We're going to talk about that later. And then from an organizational side, this is nothing unfamiliar to y'all. These are often just like the basic privacy controls that are embedded in systems and tools. And that can be from controls related to retention and deletion, or ensuring the granularity of specific data types that are revealed to a law enforcement organization, having existing procedures for on-device storage and processing. We could keep going. Ultimately, this is your day-to-day if you work in this space regularly, and ultimately it's an umbrella encompassing all of the existing known controls that we engage in, hopefully on a day-to-day basis. Procedural controls. This is not necessarily from an engineering perspective, but one we're all familiar, which is more legal processes and internal mechanisms through which likely a sophisticated organization has embedded processes for responding to and engaging with law enforcement requests. And depending on the timbre and kind of strength of the program, that may include also pushing back against spurious law enforcement requests. It may be essentially ensuring that there's a process, making sure that the needed warrants and requirements are in place before information is disclosed, and ultimately could also involve disputing these actively in court and taking a public stance. And then policy controls. This is engagement with the wider community. Ultimately can come from an organization itself, but very much is a dialogue. And this is obviously something that is near and dear to many people's hearts, but also a complex issue. If you're familiar and have been in this space long enough, you may be familiar with EFF's Who Has Your Back? And obviously has been in existence for a long time, evaluating organizations' kind of maturity when it comes to dealing with these, implementing best practices and policies related to this process. This is essentially a schema from back in 2017, when a lot of their criteria was more centered along law enforcement disclosures like this one. But many times, many of the best practices still ring true today, and ultimately can involve and call for reforming the overall process, such as pushing back on Reform 702, which for national security letters essentially allows an organization to engage in warrantless data capture, even if the intelligence target is interacting with an American citizen. So it can be risky. So what's the problem? We have all these existing controls which bound or supposedly structure this entire system. But even then, these are best practices, these are ideal situations, and even when things are working perfectly with all these different systems in place, the system can break down when exposed to externalities. And the ones we're going to be talking about today are novel ones which kind of upset our existing paradigms for trying to hold this complex process, which already has flaws, in place. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of those examples today, and then initially as examples, where we're going to be talking about Salt Typhoon to kind of crack your lens a little, give you an understanding of how this system might not be perfect, and then ultimately concluding with larger technological changes which kind of upset the whole paradigm. So, Salt Typhoon. We're getting to security space. I don't know how you guys allowed me up on the stage, but I'm here, so I'm going to talk about security. Many of you might have heard this before. This was essentially this is part of a larger campaign which was carried out in 2004, 2024, as part of an exploit of wider technological companies. But mainly what we're going to be talking about today is how Chinese threat actors were able to exploit the US lawful interception infrastructure and ultimately exploit this existing system for legitimate requests for information from organizations to gather metadata intelligence on specific targets. By exploiting the system and seeing what law enforcement was requesting from different companies, they were able to gather metadata on calls between users, IP addresses, as well as time, location associated with particular requests. So essentially enabling different surveillance capabilities. And the reason for bringing this up, or reporting has also compared this to, EFF had a piece talking about how this was related to the, essentially how in 2004, 2005, existing Ericsson telephone exchanges were tapped in order to surveil senior government officials for a period of over a year. So ultimately, this is an old problem. This is something we're not unfamiliar with, but it has deeper implications in today's world, and Lukas will tell you why.
So the deeper implications are actually, funnily enough, related to the public discourse around Salt Typhoon. If you guys saw LinkedIn when this first popped in the news cycle, people were talking about telcos being fundamentally insecurable, or how long did this breach go on for? We don't know. What does it affect? The most relevant piece of this breach for me, just my personal opinion, my takeaway from this, is that not just lawful intercept, but law enforcement response infrastructure is a unique threat vector that most threat actors from around the world try to exploit as sort of the top of their crown jewels. If you have it at your company, they're going to come for it. And it's not just a security risk, it's a privacy risk too. There are various sensitivities associated with what I just said that have nothing to do with the actual imperative to protect that infrastructure. So it's critical, regardless of where the threat actor is from or what part of the threat model you're looking at, to consider this externality as an absolute worst case scenario for infrastructure that's relevant to it, what it touches, where it is. For oversight, Ben covered it. This is somewhat self-explanatory. Whatever, and we're admittedly coming at this from a US framing, so different companies can receive process from around the world. This is just from a US perspective. Whenever the winds of change blow, and it's not just Congress reapproving 702 collection, because FISA is relatively automatic on renewal, but there's responsible debates around the structure and sort of inputs to that collection process. Oversight bodies matter, and when they are weakened or when they are disbanded, that is not something that we at companies can control for. We can influence the process, we can advocate, but we can't actually directly influence the creation of, strengthening, restructuring of an oversight body. We have to manage what we own, and that's it. And as for data, this is a little bit of a de jure way to say this, I apologize, but with the kind of, recent, very large industry-wide pivot towards artificial intelligence and machine learning, incentives around sort of data collection either grow or change, oriented towards speed of development. So if you believe yourself in the AI race, if you're consuming a foundation model, if you fork it and you use it, chances are you've had some type of change in your data collection posture as a company. Maybe you're at a startup. Maybe you're trying to figure out something new to collect or something new to design. Your incentive structure around considering how this affects whether or not your startup is going to get ripped off by a threat actor is different. It's just different. You're not necessarily considering the rest of that stuff. I'm not saying that folks in startups haven't considered that. I'm saying that generally speaking, it's not always at the top of people's consideration lists. It's very challenging to balance that against go-to-market and other priorities for different different products. Go back real quick. For generic privacy risks, this touches a bit on what Ben already mentioned, but like evaluating linkability of like data in the context of like what your organization is about to disclose, has already disclosed, its relationship with your product decisions. That's not a mapping that most, if any, company creates because of its risk and sensitivity. You can make that risk register. Do you want to own it? Like, I don't personally. So generally, like that's a unique consideration. You can go to next. Yeah. Wait, go back. Yeah. This one. So basically, the sort of call to action. What is it? It's to evaluate what you have and the gap between what you have and what you're being asked for. That changes based on where you are in the organization. But if you work in privacy in any capacity, no matter what your job ladder is, that is more our remit than a different office. I'm not asking any of you to overfunction unnecessarily. I'm asking you to just sort of familiarize yourself with your company or your organization's law enforcement response practices, because the folks that do this work day to day, we're often sort of like, we are the ones over-functioning on behalf of the rest of the office. That's not a stance unfamiliar to privacy professionals, but it's an important place to be. Next. So some recommendations, because we're coming up on time. For oversight, it's evaluation and pushback. For legislation, which is not something that you can directly control, it's an orientation towards technical solutions and controls. This concept of increasing intelligence collection literally just means if you're going to get hit with an increasing like amount and sort of cadence of requests, which you can anticipate based on like what's hot for like cops or what's hot for sort of like the government at that point in time, the whole idea is to audit your decisions against like what promotes like the best user outcome, not integrating sort of the government or different like people into your threat model. You can if you want to, again, but the whole goal is to make product decisions that focus on the user. And sometimes those like actually harmonize in a productive way. I'm being a little bit like obfuscatory, but like I think you can understand what I mean. So for telecommunications infrastructure, I can't comment on like the specific nature of like how far back the Salt Typhoon breach went, but just that I encourage you to keep in mind what some of the worst case scenarios are for telco if you ever have to deal with telephony or intercept. Data broker sophistication just means that scraping is getting better. Like morally gray groups that like have lots of big publicly available data sets can like get joined with like the stuff that government collects through normal intelligence collection methods. So it's sort of a third dark horse to consider with what cops can request from you, what the government can get on its own, and what they can buy from a data broker. If you had to draw a map, that kind of like adds to it. And then something that I've talked about with a couple of people that are in the audience is just this idea of finding a way in the community, much as we do with privacy, to sort of like think through standards for this stuff. There are existing standards for how you like handle electronic evidence, with how you sort of audit the touch points with like for threat modeling and things like that. But from a privacy standpoint, these are tricky to generate for many of the topics that have already been covered in the talks. Like they don't dovetail very well. And so it would be very interesting, because I don't know what this looks like now, but I can probably think about it over the next few years, as to how to achieve law enforcement response by design, integrated with like some type of like framework for thinking. And it's something that, you know, if folks are interested, I'd love to chat about it later.
Ultimately, takeaways are, we are trying to elucidate this very complex issue, one which has lasted or existed for a long period of time, but also is changed and modified by evolving technologies, frameworks, and issues. And our main goal with this is to bring you into the fold of this topic, because these are guided by decisions that you all are making every day. So you can help. You can be involved in this process and come up with solutions. We could be here all day, and please find us later so we can talk about this issue. But ultimately, it's on you all to engage with this and think about ways in which it can properly be addressed within your organization and beyond. So thank you.